Close the door of an A80 Supra. One thud. Solid, low, final. The way a bank vault sounds when it seals. Then start the engine. 6 cylinders canceling their own vibrations. The 2JZGTE at idle is smooth in the way that well-engineered things are smooth. Not quiet. Smooth. You feel the difference in the seat and the soles of your feet. That engine, with nothing changed from the assembly line, has made 1,000 horsepower, documented, repeatable, verified over 30 years by builders who had every reason to be skeptical. Toyota knew exactly what they were building. They built it anyway, then they walked away from it entirely. To understand how an engine like the 2JZGTE came to exist, you have to understand the world that paid for it. Japan in the late 1980s was unlike anything the country had seen before or since. The economy was expanding at a pace that felt almost fictional. Real estate values in Tokyo had climbed so high that the land beneath the Imperial Palace was, by some estimates, worth more than the entire state of California. Corporate balance sheets were flush. And inside the engineering divisions of Japan's great automakers, something remarkable was happening. Money stopped being the constraint. The directive coming down from Toyota's leadership for the 4th generation Supra program was straightforward. Build something that defines what Toyota can do. Cost is not the concern. The concern is the result. Toyota wasn't alone in this. Nissan was developing what would become the R32 GT-R. Honda was quietly working on the NSX, which would eventually convince the world that a mid-engine supercar did not need to be violent or unreliable. The 3 companies were in a quiet competition that was not really about sales figures. It was about which of them could produce the definitive statement of what Japanese engineering was capable of. For Toyota, the answer was the A80. The A70 generation had been a capable grand tourer, comfortable and quick, with a personality closer to a refined cruiser than a focused performance machine. It was well-liked. It was not legendary. The A80 program was a conscious decision to change that. The engineers were not tasked with building a better version of the A70. They were tasked with building something that could stand alongside the best Europe had to offer. Porsche's 911 was the reference point. Ferrari was the aspiration. The goal was to build something unmistakably Japanese, built to a standard that neither of those companies could dismiss. The A80 was never going to be a volume product. Everyone inside Toyota understood this. The engineering investment meant the car would run at a loss, regardless of how many units moved. This was accepted. A halo car earns back its development costs slowly, through the reputation it builds, through the buyers who walk into a showroom and choose a Camry or a Corolla because somewhere in the back of their minds, they remember that Toyota also builds something extraordinary. So, the engineers got to work. They were given a target, a timeline, and the rarest resource in the history of product development. They were given enough. What came out of that program was an inline 6-cylinder engine, a chassis built to structural tolerances Toyota had never attempted before, and a car that would outlast the era that created it by decades. The bubble would eventually burst. The budgets would disappear, but the engineering those budgets paid for was already cast in iron. The engineers had their mandate. Now they had to build something worthy of it. The decision that defined everything else came early. When the team sat down to spec the bottom end of the new engine, they chose a cast iron block. By the early 90s, aluminum was already becoming standard in high-performance engines. It was lighter, and in a sports car, weight is almost always the enemy. Toyota's engineers knew this. They chose iron anyway. Cast iron holds its shape under heat and pressure in ways that aluminum cannot match. If the goal was an engine that could be pushed far beyond its factory rating, iron was the only honest answer. The crankshaft was forged, not cast. Forging aligns the grain structure of the metal, so the crank resists torsional stress more effectively, flexing less under extreme load. Toyota did not need a forged crank at the factory output of 276 horsepower. The number they were apparently designing toward was much higher, even if no one said it out loud. The block used a closed deck architecture, meaning the cylinder bores are almost fully surrounded by block material at the top, leaving only small coolant passages. Closed deck designs resist the cylinder wall flex that destroys head gaskets under boost. It is more complex and more expensive to build. It is also the reason 2JZ blocks absorb pressure that would crack a lesser design. The main bearing journals were oversized, giving the crankshaft more contact area than the factory output required. More bearing surface means lower unit loading, less wear, and more tolerance for the rotational forces that come with serious power. The result was a bottom end that was, in the most literal sense, over-engineered for its stated purpose. Then came the turbocharger system, and this is where the engineering became genuinely elegant. The 2JZ GTE used two turbochargers arranged in a sequential configuration rather than a parallel one. At low engine speeds, only the primary turbocharger is working. This smaller unit spools quickly because it does not need to process the full exhaust volume, which kills the lag that ruins the driving character of so many turbocharged engines. As revs climb and exhaust flow increases, the second turbocharger comes online progressively, adding top-end power without the hesitation that plagued earlier twin-turbo designs. The result was a torque curve that felt almost naturally aspirated in the low and mid-range, then extended hard toward the red line in a way that no single turbo of that era could match. The cylinder head completed the picture. The port geometry was designed with a specific focus on flow efficiency, allowing the engine to breathe cleanly, even under significant boost pressure. This matters because an engine under boost is essentially being asked to process far more air and fuel than its displacement would normally allow. A head that restricts flow becomes the ceiling. Toyota's head design kept that ceiling high enough that it almost never became the limiting factor in a modified build. Taken together, the block, the crank, the closed deck, the bearing journals, the sequential turbos, and the head geometry produced something the factory dyno sheets did not reflect. The official output was conservative, deliberately so. What Toyota had actually built was a 2JZ GTE with a structural ceiling somewhere north of 1,000 horsepower on completely stock internal components. The engine was extraordinary, but Toyota's engineers understood something that gets lost in the conversation around the 2JZ. An engine is only as good as the platform built to contain it. The 80 chassis was designed with the same refusal to compromise that produced the engine sitting inside it. The body structure started from a decision that was, by 1993 standards, still not obvious for a production sports car at Toyota's price point. The A80 was built around a fully independent suspension setup at all four corners, with near-perfect front-to-rear weight distribution as a non-negotiable target, not an aspiration. The engineers were not chasing a number because it looked good in a brochure. They were chasing it because weight distribution is the foundation. Everything else in a performance car is built on. Get that wrong, and no amount of suspension tuning corrects it. Get it right, and the car behaves predictably at the limit, which is exactly where a driver needs to trust it most. The structural rigidity targets were equally serious. Toyota set torsional stiffness goals for the A80 that exceeded anything the company had produced before in a road-going sports car. A rigid structure is the prerequisite for suspension geometry in a work as designed. If the body flexes, the geometry changes with it, and the carefully calculated camber and toe settings become moving targets instead of fixed inputs. Toyota's engineers understood this, so they built the shell to resist flex at loads the car would never encounter on a public road. They were building to a margin, the same way they built the engine to a margin. The result was a platform that felt planted and direct, in a way that competitors at similar price points simply did not. Sourcing the gearbox from Germany rather than building their own was a decision that said something about where Toyota's priorities lay. The Getrag 6-speed unit they chose was already respected in European performance applications. It was precise, it was durable, and it was better than anything Toyota could have developed in the available timeline without compromising something else. The engineers had no interest in building inferior components just to keep everything in-house. The goal was the best possible result. If that meant sourcing a gearbox from Bavaria, that was the correct decision, and no further debate was required. The aerodynamic development followed the same logic. The drag coefficient target was worked toward with wind tunnel time and measurable data, not with styling input. The A80's shape was not designed to be dramatic. It was designed to be efficient. The rear wing was functional, not decorative. The underbody treatment was intended to manage airflow in ways that produced real downforce at real speeds. This was unusual for a production car in this segment. Most manufacturers at this price point were still prioritizing visual impact over actual aerodynamic performance. Toyota's team was less interested in how the car looked in a showroom and more interested in how it behaved at 200 kilometers per hour. The interior carried the same sensibility. The materials were chosen for durability and tactile quality rather than showroom flash. The switchgear had a solidity to it. The seating position was considered and deliberate. Nothing about the cabin felt like it had been value engineered. It felt like a space built around a person who intended to use the car seriously, not someone who wanted to impress valet parking attendants. What the A80 represented, taken as a complete object, was a philosophical statement about what a performance car should be. Every system, the structure, the suspension, the gearbox, the aerodynamics, the interior, had been developed to the same standard as the engine. There were no weak links because the mandate did not allow for them. The car was finished. The engineering was complete. Toyota had built exactly what they set out to build. The world it was about to enter, though, had already started to change. The A80 arrived in North American showrooms in 1993 with a price tag that stopped people in their tracks. The twin-turbo model came in above $40,000, which put it in direct conversation with cars from Stuttgart and Maranello rather than the imports most buyers associated with Toyota. The automotive press understood exactly what they were looking at. Road tests praised the engine's delivery, the chassis balance, and the seriousness of the whole package. The reviews were strong, the sales were not. Buyers hesitated. $40,000 for a Toyota was a genuinely difficult proposition in that moment, regardless of what the car could do. The brand reputation hadn't caught up to the engineering yet. People who could afford a car at that price point were often walking into European dealerships on reflex because that's where performance at that price was supposed to come from. The A80 sat in a strange space, too expensive for the buyers who trusted Toyota instinctively, and too unfamiliar for the buyers who spent freely on performance cars. But while the showrooms moved slowly, something else was happening in garages and small workshops across the country. The tuner community found the 2JZ almost immediately. Shops that built their business around pulling power from Japanese platforms recognized something unusual in that cast iron block. Factory boost pressure was conservative, and the internals had headroom that no one at Toyota had officially acknowledged. Within the first year of availability, the people who understood engines at a structural level were already asking a different question. Not what the 2JZ made from the factory, but how far it could actually go. The answers came quickly, and they kept getting better. The sequential turbo system was replaced with single large frame setups. Boost pressure climbed, and dyno numbers climbed with it. The engine, completely stock with its factory pistons, rods, and crankshaft, kept holding together. 600 horsepower, 700, 800. The block did not care. The bottom end that Toyota's engineers had built to a ceiling they never officially acknowledged was revealing that ceiling, and it was higher than almost anyone had predicted. Then 1998 arrived, and a film crew needed a car for a street racing scene. The Fast and the Furious came out in 2001, and the orange Supra that appeared in its final act did something that no amount of press coverage had managed. It put the car in front of an audience that did not read automotive publications and did not follow time attack results. It made the Supra the symbol of a specific idea, that a modified Japanese car could humiliate a Ferrari on a straight road. The scene was fiction, but the engineering underneath was not. The film arrived at exactly the moment when the tuner community had already proven what the platform was capable of, and the wider culture suddenly had a frame of reference for all of it. The underground drag and time attack scenes that had been building around the A80 since the mid-90s accelerated. Documented passes into the 9-second quarter mile on stock internals became reference points that the entire modified car world measured itself against. The Supra became the benchmark, not just within its own category, but across the broader tuner landscape. If you wanted to argue that your build was serious, you compared it to what someone had done with a 2JZ. The global picture was more complex. Japan and the United Kingdom had understood the car from the beginning, markets where driving engagement was a genuine purchasing criterion and where the A80's balance and precision were recognized immediately for what they were. North America came to it later, partly through the film, partly through the reputation the tuner community built over nearly a decade of documented results. By the late 90s, the Supra had become two things at once. It was a depreciated used car that the original showroom buyers had moved on from, and it was the foundation of one of the most respected performance platforms the modified car world had ever worked with. Both of those things were true at the same time. And back in Toyota's boardroom, a very different conversation was taking place. The bubble era did not end with a single event. It deflated slowly, the way those things always do, through a series of policy decisions and market corrections that took years to fully register inside corporate planning departments. By the mid-90s, the balance sheets that had funded programs like the A80 looked very different from what they had looked like at the start of the decade. The money was not gone, but the feeling that money was infinite was gone, and it changed how decisions got made. The yen was the first pressure point. Japan's currency strengthened significantly against the dollar through the late 90s, and for a car built entirely in Japan and shipped to North America, this created a cost structure that became progressively harder to defend. Every unit Toyota exported at a fixed retail price was effectively generating less revenue new in domestic terms than it had the year before. The A80 had never been a profitable product. That had been understood and accepted when the program was approved. But there is a difference between losing money on a car when budgets are flush and losing money on a car when the finance department is already asking hard questions about everything else on the lineup. The second pressure came from the regulatory environment. Emission standards in the United States and Europe were tightening on a schedule that showed no signs of slowing. The 2JZ GTE's calibration, which had been developed in a different regulatory climate, was becoming harder to certify without modifications that would compromise the character of the engine. Recalibrating a forced induction engine to satisfy new standards is not simply a software update. It involves fuel mapping, boost control, and catalytic converter chemistry, all of which interact with each other in ways that change how the engine behaves in the real world. The version of the 2JZ GTE that cleared the new standards would not have been the same engine. Toyota's engineers understood this, and the conclusion they reached was uncomfortable. Updating the 80 platform to meet the next generation of regulations was possible. The question was whether the investment made any sense given the numbers behind it. It did not. The A80 had never sold in meaningful volume. This had always been part of its identity. A halo car is not supposed to sell like a Corolla, but when Toyota looked at the cost of a comprehensive update, covering emissions compliance, safety standard revisions, and the structural changes that would have been required to meet new crash test protocols, the math produced a number that the sales data simply could not justify. The platform would have needed to move dramatically more units than it ever had to recover that investment, and nothing in the market suggested that was going to happen. The buyers who had always wanted the car were already buying used examples. The buyers who had not bought one yet were not likely to be converted by a revised version at a higher price point. What made the decision feel almost inevitable was the direction Toyota's leadership was already moving. The Prius program had arrived in 1997, and it had done something much more significant than launch a new product. It had reoriented the company's self-image. Toyota had decided that the thing they wanted to be known for going into the 21st century was not performance. It was efficiency. It was responsibility. It was the idea that a car company could be part of the solution to problems that the entire industry had spent decades making worse. That identity had genuine corporate conviction behind it. It was not marketing language. It was a philosophical shift that reached into every division and changed what leadership valued. Against that backdrop, a low-volume sports car with a fuel-hungry twin, turbocharged inline-six, and a compliance problem was not a priority. It was a legacy item, the product of a different era with a different set of values. In 2002, production of the A80 ended. There was no announcement designed to mark the occasion. No ceremony, no farewell edition, no statement from Toyota's leadership about what the car had meant. The line simply stopped, the way lines do when the decision has already been made and documented and filed away. The Supra was gone, and nobody at Toyota seemed to think the world would particularly notice. They were wrong about that. In the years immediately following the discontinuation, the used market treated the A80 the way it treats most outgoing sports cars. Prices softened. The buyers who had ordered them new moved on to other things, and the cars filtered down through the secondary market at prices that reflected their age rather than their engineering. A clean, low-mileage twin-turbo example in the mid-$2,000 range could be found for well under $20,000. The original $40,000 investment had evaporated. On paper, it looked like depreciation working exactly as it was supposed to. The tuner community saw something different. Without Toyota's involvement, without any factory support or official documentation of what the platform could do, the shops and builders who had been working with the 2JZ since the mid-90s simply kept going. The discontinuation removed the new car supply, but did nothing to reduce interest in the platform. If anything, it concentrated it. The people still working with A80s at this point were not casual enthusiasts. They were serious builders who had spent years learning the engine's limits and had not yet found them. The horsepower numbers climbed past what the early tuner scene had thought was the ceiling. 1,000 horsepower on stock internals had been the benchmark. Then came builds pushing 1,500, documented on dynos and verified in competition. Then 2,000 in dedicated drag applications where the entire car was built around extracting the absolute maximum from that cast iron block. The 2JZ kept absorbing it. The architecture Toyota's engineers had designed in the late 80s. The closed deck, the oversized bearing journals, the forged crankshaft was revealing its full depth to people who had the patience and the skill to reach it. The engine also started moving, not just between Supra chassis, but into entirely different platforms. Drift teams pulled 2JZ units and dropped them into older Toyota chassis, into Nissan bodies, into anything that could be made to accept the block's dimensions. The engine became a transplant option the way few engines ever do, not because it was the cheapest solution or the easiest to source, but because its reputation for surviving power levels that destroyed alternatives was now established fact. There are documented cases of 2JZ-based marine applications, the engine finding its way into boat racing because the combination of torque, tunability, and structural tolerance made it genuinely competitive outside of automotive use entirely. Collector awareness came gradually, then all at once. Through the late 2000s, the cultural footprint the A80 had built in the tuner scene, and through its film appearances, was slowly being translated into a different kind of value recognition. Enthusiasts who had been too young to buy one new were now at the point in their careers where they could afford to. The cars they had grown up watching, the ones they had built in video games and researched in magazines, were sitting in classifieds at prices that felt almost unreasonable, given what the platform was. The buying started, quietly at first, then with more urgency as the better examples became harder to find. The price trajectory that followed told the story with the clarity that markets sometimes produce when everything else is complicated. A car that had been trading for $15,000 in 2005 was crossing six figures by the early 2010s for clean, low-mileage examples. By the mid-2010s, the trajectory had become steep. Unmolested twin-turbo models in documented condition were approaching the kind of values usually reserved for Italian exotics, with far shorter production runs. The market had corrected its original misreading of the A80. It had taken 2 decades, but the pricing had eventually caught up to the engineering. Quality, it turns out, is not always recognized in the moment it is delivered. Sometimes it takes time for the world to understand what it was given. Toyota eventually noticed what the market was telling them. By the mid-2010s, the A80's collector trajectory was impossible to ignore. The name carried weight that Toyota had not actively maintained, but also had not managed to extinguish. A generation of enthusiasts had grown up with the Supra as a reference point, a fixed standard against which everything else in the modified car world was measured. The brand equity was sitting there, accumulated through decades of tuner culture and documented results, and it belonged entirely to a car Toyota had stopped building in 2002. The decision to revive the name was understandable. The way it was done revealed something important about how much the world had changed since the bubble era. The GR Supra arrived in 2019, built on a platform shared with BMW Z4. The engine was a BMW inline 6. The electronics architecture, the suspension tuning philosophy, the fundamental bones of the car came from a partnership between Toyota and a German manufacturer whose engineering culture and cost structure are entirely different from the environment that produced the A80. The arrangement made sense on paper. It compressed development time. It spread compliance costs across 2 platforms. It put a car called Supra into showrooms faster than an entirely in-house program could have managed. The GR Supra is a capable machine. Anyone who has driven one knows it handles well, responds honestly, and delivers genuine driving engagement. This is not a criticism of the product. It is a capable, well-sorted performance car, but it is not the same thing. And the community that cares most about the Supra name understood that distinction immediately. The absence of a Toyota-built engine is the symbolic break that everything else follows from. The 2JZ GTE was not just a powertrain choice. It was the physical evidence of a specific philosophy that Toyota's own engineers, given enough resources and enough time, could build something that exceeded what anyone else had thought possible. The GR Supra's engine is good. It is someone else's engine. The philosophical continuity is broken in a way that a badge and a roofline cannot repair. What the GR Supra's existence actually confirms, more clearly than any argument could, is that the A80 cannot be replicated under modern constraints. The regulatory environment, the development economics, the corporate priorities that now shape every major manufacturer's product decisions, none of it allows for the kind of program that produced the 2JZ GTE. The bubble-era funding is gone. The mandate to build without a cost ceiling is gone. The willingness to run a product at a loss, purely for what it represents, is gone. The GR Supra is what a Supra looks like when all of those things are gone. It is a good car built in a different world. The 2JZ GTE is a document cast in iron. It tells the story of a specific moment in industrial history, a moment when a group of engineers received a mandate that most engineers never get, and used it to build something that has outlasted everything around it. The A80 proved what happens when ambition isn't managed by accountants. The result wasn't just a fast car, it was a permanent thing, still relevant, still setting standards, still holding together under loads that destroy lesser designs. That moment is gone. The budgets, the philosophy, the willingness to build for a ceiling nobody officially acknowledged. All of it ended when the bubble did. Click on this next video if you want to understand why the Lexus LS430 was built to sound like silence at 70 miles per hour, and why it survived while its German rivals turned into financial nightmares.